英検1級に出た副詞354。スタート。
abruptly, absolutely, accordingly, accurately, actively, actually, adequately, admirably, admittedly, affectionately, afterward, again, allegedly, almost, alternatively, altogether, amazingly, ambitiously, angrily, anxiously, apparently, appropriately, arbitrarily, arguably, artificially, asleep, astonishingly, attentively, automatically, badly, barely, beautifully, beforehand, believably, beneath, bitterly, blindly, boldly, briefly, brilliantly, briskly, broadly, calmly, carefully, casually, cautiously, certainly, chiefly, clearly, closely, collectively, comfortably, commonly, comparatively, competently, completely, confidently, consciously, considerably, consistently, constantly, contemporarily, continually, continuously, contrarily, convincingly, correctly, critically, cruelly, curiously, dangerously, daringly, decently, decisively, deeply, deliberately, delicately, demandingly, desperately, detrimentally, differently, diligently, directly, distinctly, dramatically, drastically, earnestly, easily, effectively, efficiently, elaborately, electrically, emotionally, emphatically, endlessly, energetically, enormously, entirely, equally, especially, essentially, ethically, eventually, evidently, exactly, exclusively, extensively, extremely, faintly, faithfully, familiarly, favorably, fearlessly, feasibly, firmly, flexibly, fluently, formally, formerly, freely, frequently, frightfully, frugally, fully, generally, gently, genuinely, gladly, globally, gradually, gratefully, greatly, grimly, grossly, habitually, hardly, hastily, heavily, helplessly, hesitantly, highly, hopefully, hopelessly, horizontally, hurriedly, ideally, identically, illegally, immediately, immensely, impartially, implicitly, importantly, impressively, inaccurately, independently, indifferently, indirectly, individually, inevitably, ingeniously, initially, innocently, instantly, intellectually, intensely, intentionally, interestingly, intermittently, internally, intimately, invariably, ironically, irregularly, jokingly, joyfully, judiciously, justifiably, keenly, kindly, knowingly, largely, lastly, legally, lightly, literally, locally, logically, loosely, loudly, lovingly, loyally, luckily, magnificently, mainly, manually, markedly, masterfully, materially, meaningfully, mechanically, mentally, merely, mildly, miraculously, moderately, modestly, momentarily, morally, mostly, mutually, naturally, nearly, neatly, negatively, nervously, never, nevertheless, normally, notably, noticeably, nowadays, obviously, occasionally, officially, openly, optimistically, ordinarily, originally, painfully, partially, particularly, patiently, perfectly, periodically, permanently, persistently, personally, physically, plainly, pleasantly, politely, positively, potentially, practically, precisely, preferably, primarily, principally, privately, profoundly, progressively, prominently, promptly, properly, proportionally, publicly, purely, purposefully, quickly, quietly, radically, randomly, rapidly, rarely, readily, reasonably, recently, recklessly, regularly, relatively, reluctantly, repeatedly, reproachfully, respectfully, responsibly, restlessly, roughly, routinely, sadly, safely, satisfactorily, seamlessly, seemingly, selectively, selfishly, sensibly, separately, seriously, sharply, shortly, significantly, silently, similarly, simply, simultaneously, sincerely, slowly, smoothly, solemnly, specifically, spontaneously, steadily, sternly, strategically, strictly, strongly, stubbornly, stunningly, subsequently, substantially, successfully, suddenly, suitably, superficially, surely, surprisingly, suspiciously, symbolically, systematically, tactfully, technically, temporarily, tenderly, thankfully, theoretically, thoroughly, thoughtfully, timidly, tirelessly, totally, traditionally, tragically, transparently, truly, typically, unexpectedly, uniquely, universally, urgently, usefully, usually, utterly, vaguely, valiantly, vividly, voluntarily, widely, wisely, wittily, wonderfully, worriedly, wrongly, zealously,